this issue, I think, is really something that we sort of struggle a lot with, the issue about fair representation and fair, sort of voice of African countries at the IMF. I mean, as the concept not says, right now we are at 5%. And what the big issue is, first of all, we need to know, when we talked about IMF quota reform, what are we trying to achieve? Because when you're talking about reform, you want to, you have some objective that you want to achieve. And in this case, for African countries, what do we want to do? Yes, we want to have more quota. Why? Because of course it's the metric that the IMF use to provide loans, and so of course the more you get, the more you actually have, availability to IMF resources. That's one. You want to have also more quota. Why? Because also that's the metric that we use to measure the voting power of the country. And of course, you want to have a more say on that. But what happened is, as you all know, we are in a situation where until early 1960s, there was 3 founding members: Ethiopia, Egypt, and of course, the other one being
Liberia and South Africa.
Liberia and South Africa. And when the countries joined, they of course find some rule of the game that they had to sort of comply with. So what are the rule of the game? So right now, the quotas of a country actually are determined based, we talked a lot about GDP, because GDP is the largest factor, the one that has the largest weight, but it's not the only one. So there are also other sort of variables that are in the quota formula, including trade within the regional trade and other type of thing. Until sometime there was also what they call variability, and variability was specifically introduced in the quota formula of the IMF to represent, actually to favor borrowing countries. Unfortunately, at some point there was some discussion that it had to be removed, and of course that is not really in our benefit. So that's another thing. And I think what it means is what, like right now, when we talked about quota reform, we're talking about, as Mavis was putting it earlier, it's a geopolitical sort of discussion. When we work at the board, there are basically 2 types of shareholders that work together. There was, of course, on one hand, you have the advanced economies, you have, of course, the US and the EU and others. On the other hand, you have the developing countries. At that time, we used to call them the G11. So there was the BRICS countries and, of course, African countries and others. Why? Because when you fight a battle or when you're trying to achieve something, you want to actually make a coalition with those who actually have similar interests. And of course, as African executive directors, we tended to have the same sort of claims as other emerging market and developing countries. So we used to have that G11 grouping that used to meet regularly to see how we could coordinate our position when it came to quota reform. And we used even some time to issue what we call joint statements. So when the board happened, we would sort of get together and meet. So all of that to give you just the context before I respond. I think the key message that I would say is quota reform is a political issue, and most likely the solution would be political. Yes, there are some technicalities that needs to be discussed. What should be the right variable in the quota formula? What should be the weight? What should be all of those things? But that's so technical, because that, those technical sort of considerations are meant to sort of respond to a political sort of guidance or measure or options, and that's where the issue is. I think you mentioned it earlier that the US has a veto. It's maybe there I need to qualify it a little bit. Yes, the US has, in terms of voting power, more than 16%. And at the IMF Executive Board, all the major decisions are usually taken at the 85% majority, which means that, of course, if the US doesn't agree, nothing happens. But what happened, and that's where I'm clarifying it, is there is also an effort to take decision by consensus. What it means is, yes, sometimes most of the decision, when it's, let's say, comes to lending to a country or those type of things, we don't require 85% majority. It's just a simple majority. And I think where it happened, the vote is not even counting. I have never been to a board meeting where we resorted to doing votes to make to take a decision. We tend to try to, so 24 country executive directors try to discuss and see what's the best and what's the middle ground that we can agree to, and then take a decision. Unfortunately, on the quota reform, there has not been so far any major consensus, since of course there is that great power competition among the US, the China, and others. Why? Because the IMF is supposed to be a rules-based institution, and for long it has said that if you have this economic sort of power, it's going to be reflected into your quota. Unfortunately, China has that, but unfortunately, right now, China is a 19 trillion economy. The US is a 26. The US has a 16% voting power. China has 6%. It's not supposed to be that way. China is supposed to be actually much closer to the US, but unfortunately, it's not the case. China is right now has a voting power that is lower than Japan, and Japan is, everyone knows that Japan is the third economy. So all of that, why? Because there is some sort of there are some problems into agreeing on how we should move forward in terms of reforming the quota system at the IMF. And that, my sense is, and my experience tells me that it's not going to be overcome so long as there is no political sort of consensus. It's not going to be at the board of the IMF that the solution is going to come. It's not going to be, at the IMFC. It's going to be at the political level. And for that, where I think, organizations that are around here can really push is by making sure that this discussion is really sort of pushed in the public domain, and making sure that, of course, the political authorities are very much aware of the urgency of making sure that this is, because it has a lot of implication for us as Africa, right? Because, we used to fight as executive director for our countries to have more access to IMF resources. And sometimes it was kind of frustrating, because even if you do so and the IMF say, okay, let's raise the access limit to 100%, like for emerging financing. Well, you take a country like Central African Republic, its quota is so insignificant that, even those was 100% of quota is not really very much sort of solve much problem. And I think those are the implications that we are facing. That's one. Another implication is, yes, as executive director, I used to represent 23 African countries that was taken together was less than 2% of voting power. Of course, the only way I could have been sort of effective was to find a way to build coalition around us, so that we can have our main sort of priority position being shared by the majority, and that's the only way you can actually move. So, and that's not necessarily bad, because that's how it works in a board. But I think in some situation, I think you want to have a situation, a country where, an organization that is much more fair in terms of things. Now, one last, and I'm going to finish there. I think we always tend to say, okay, maybe we need to go, down the road of the UN, one country, one vote. You also have to think about the shortcoming of the UN system in terms of mobilizing resources, in terms of decision making, in terms of actually the proneness to really being, constrained in a major decision. I think that's also a balance that has to be taken. No matter what we say, I think at the IMF, things get done, things move, apart from, of course, the governance issues. And of course, we are not happy, because I think African countries are not getting as much as they wanted to. And that's a constant battle. But I think the solution would have to come from this politics.
But so, to ask her last question again, so how can we improve the way the IMF works with their partner countries? In terms of, so they said that, I think maybe she was saying that there was sort of bad practice on the IMF side in terms of policies that they were putting forward. So how can we have a better working relationship?
Well, you have to remember that the 24 executive directors that the IMF represent the 190 members of the IMF. So what it means is, if you are able to have consensus capital level, you know that the IMF is going to be forced to follow what's the board guidance that it receives. So what's the best way? There are many ways to improve the relation between the IMF and our countries. First of all, is at the board level, to make sure that the boards agree on a number of on some consensus, how do you say, principles, and that guides IMF work into in our countries. I think that's the first stage. The second stage is the board itself to does its job in terms of holding the IMF management and the staff accountable. That's an issue there, because I think it's the nature of the governance system at the IMF that also make it a lot more difficult to achieve that. Why? Because, well, the board, the 24 members, their chair is the IMF managing director, and the IMF managing director is the chief of the staff. Of course, there is, of course, some synergy between the managing director and the staff, but there is, sometimes when you come as executive board members, you tend to be looked at as I would not say an adversary, but in some ways, I think the relation might not be actually extremely fluid between the board and the staff and management. So I think that's where also the issue is. Yes, the managing director is the chair, but I think the board of the IMF has to find the way to keep them very much in check by having very strong sort of performance metrics that they would have to follow. They're doing it now, but maybe it's not effective enough for having that type of fluid relation between the IMF staff and the countries. One last thing also, I think we also have to look at from our side, what is it that we should do at the country level to build our capacities to negotiate better with the IMF staff. I have been to tens or even maybe hundreds of missions with the IMF staff in some of our countries, and believe me, I think in some cases there are a lot of capacities, and that you can understand. If you take, for instance, a small fragile state with limited capacity, with a high turnover, it's very difficult for them to really have in ministries and central banks, the capacity that they need to really sort of negotiate with IMF stuff. In those countries, they tend to take the IMF stuff as being the gods, right? Whatever they say, that's what we need to implement, because they don't have the capacity. But I think so it means capacity development and capacity building in those countries. But in other major countries also, I think that's the issue is not about capacity. It's sometimes also about political commitment. Because whatever you may say, sometimes the IMF is used as an excuse for, it's a political sort of, how do you say?
It's a game.
It's a game, right? Because I'm a minister of finance. I have to take some tough decision. Well, I would blame the IMF, and of course make sure that my population is very much understanding. What I'm saying is, I think it's a combination of capacity and a combination of political commitment and political will that actually make it also difficult to really improve the relation between the IMF and the staff and the countries. What Africa should do is easy. I think you have to be pragmatic. When you negotiate in a situation where you have various sort of interests, what matters is, of course, to push it for your interests. So you need to, first of all, of course, make sure that the US is on board when we're talking about IMF quota reform, because otherwise nothing happens, because they statutorily, legally, they have that veto, and you have to make sure that you discuss with them so that it's something that happens. But at the same time, you also have to build your coalition with others, like China, like the BRICS, right? Because simply we do have the same sort of interest into making sure that the quota reform happen in our favor. So that's what you need to do. I don't think actually it is in Africa's interest to take side. What matters is you keep strengthening your relation with your traditional partners and also with your new partners.